Hi, everybody, and welcome to San Diego Comic-Con, Comic-Con at Home, and to our AAPI Voices panel. I am so excited to have some amazing authors with us today. You're going to be hearing about some of the best books out there, and they are also by AAPI creators, which makes them even better. First, I'll say my name is Caitlin Whalen. I'm a marketing manager at Penguin Random House, working with the RHCV group. And I'm going to first introduce our amazing panelists with us today. I will start with Trung Le Nguyen, who is the author of The Magic Fish. We also have Elizabeth Lim, who is the author of the Spin the Dawn series and the upcoming, or by the time you're viewing this, the already on sale and likely in your hands, Six Crimson and Cream series. That's the first book. There it is. And then we also have Amelie Wen Zhoa with us, who's the author of the Blood Air series. Red Tigress is the second book in that series. Make sure you're already writing down your TBRs. You may have already read some of these books. All of them are worthy of a reread. So go ahead and dive into them again. To get started today, I would love to start with some just fun, quick questions to get the conversation going. So this first super important question for all of you is, what was your very favorite childhood snack or treat?
Just off the top of my head, I'm going to go first. I'm going to say White Rabbit candy. I was obsessed. So
yes, that's a good one.
I'm trying to think. I'm coming up with a blank because there were so many, but White Rabbit was definitely one of the ones that I loved. I just remember like I tried to, I don't know if you guys know what it is, but it's like there's the kind of rice paper wrapped around it, and then inside it's like this milky candy. So at first I thought we could eat the actual wrapper. So I remember like I popped the whole thing in my mouth, and then my mom was like, no, just eat the rice paper inside. You don't eat the blue wrapper outside. But I do remember, I did love White Rabbit.
Yeah, it's so delicious. I actually was kind of the opposite. I would try to peel off the rice paper because I thought you couldn't eat that.
What about you,
mine would have to
Chun?
be lychee jellies.
Yeah.
I just love the big tubs that they came in, and peeling them was always kind of hit or miss because you either get one that came out really easily or you'd have to struggle with it for a really long time, and that was always a little weirdly exciting for me.
Those were always exciting. My mom would hide them like Halloween candy on like the highest shelf. And it was like you could see them because they were in the clear containers. And you're like, one day I'll be tall, Mom, and you won't be able to stop me. There's nothing like going through like the snack section at our Chinese grocery store. And I'm like, everything. I need the pandas. I need the yin yang sticks, everything. Pokey. Oh, love it all. Okay. So now that we're all hungry, we're going to start talking books with no snacks. My next big question for you is, what are you most looking forward to this summer?
I think just things opening up. It's been such a strange year, and I remember like everything's closing down, and then now I'm vaccinated, so like I've been starting to go out, and I had my first dinner and brunch this past weekend, but I'm looking forward to that, and then also just stepping into bookstores again. I remember this a couple weeks ago. I went into a bookstore, a Barnes & Noble, for the first time in a whole year, and it was just a magical experience.
I think that first bookstore trip, I went to my first indie for the past year in person. I bought 6 books, and I was in Massachusetts. I flew for the first time because I'm vaccinated. And like all my friends were like, don't you have to fly back? And I was like, but they're books. It doesn't count as weight. It doesn't count. It'll be fine. Elizabeth, what about you?
I'm really just hoping to spend more time with family. My parents are actually here visiting, so it's been really nice to see them. And I have plans to visit them this summer in California, so it'll be nice to like finally fly out and like see my old childhood home and spend time and hopefully see my grandma as well. So I'm excited for that. And also my deadlines will all be over, so I just really want to sit down and read.
A real summer vacation for you.
Yeah.
And Trung?
Well, I moved over the summer, over last summer, like a year ago, and then like it was during the pandemic, and so I was really looking forward to like getting to know my new library, and I haven't been able to go there, so I want to go check it out. I really want to go.
Oh, that's
I'm very
a good
excited
one.
about that.
Okay, but then I have to ask an important follow-up question based on your move. The chickens, they moved with you?
They did, yes. They were very accommodating about the move for some reason. They're not accommodating about anything else, but apparently a huge life change. They're like, this is fine.
And for everyone tuning in who doesn't know, Trung has the most amazing chickens. You should definitely follow him on Twitter. It's it's incredible content, and it'll make your day, guaranteed. So now that we've gone over those questions, I'd love to obviously talk about your books a little bit. So Elizabeth, I'll start with you. Can you tell us about the first installment in your new fantasy series that, by the time everyone's viewing, just went on sale earlier this month, Six Crimson Cranes?
Sure. Six Crimson Cranes is my newest book. It's set in the same universe as my previous series, Spin the Dawn, but it's completely its own story. You won't have had to read Spin the Dawn. It's based on the fairy tale The Wild Swans by Hans Christian Andersen. So in my take, it's about a princess whose six feathers are turned into cranes, and she has to break their curse with the help of a shape-shifting dragon, a flying paper bird, and the boy she was supposed to marry but rejected. So it's a lot of fun, and Shiori, the main character, is my favorite character that I've written so far. She goes through a really wonderful character arc and has an incredible journey, and I can't wait for everyone to read it.
Oh, Shiori she's iconic. She's such a free spirit at the beginning, but then the way she harnesses her power and the responsibilities at hand, it is incredible to watch her grow. So again, because people have probably already read this book, because we're a little ways into July by the time you're viewing, is there anything you can tease to in book 2, or what can readers expect to see of Shiori next?
Without spoiling anything, I will say there's a lot more dragons in book 2.
I mean, Comic-Con people, what else do you need to hear? Dragons, keyword, key search keyword.
Exactly.
All right, Trung, can you tell us about your debut graphic novel, The Magic Fish?
Sure, yes. So my debut graphic novel is The Magic Fish. It's been out since October, and it's kind of a story about stories. I set out to tell a story, something along the lines of The Princess Bride, and then it got very, very heavy somewhere along the way. But it discusses kind of queerness and immigration and how to address those things across a language and cultural barrier. And so I use the format of a graphic novel to explore the visual imagination of each of the characters who tell fairy tales and stories to each other. And so the story goes that there's a young boy in middle school, and he and his mother like to read bedtime stories to each other, fairy tales, so that his mother could shore up her English skills, and so that he can sort of like communicate with her about the things that are going on in his life. And he has a crush on a boy in his class, and he wants to tell her, and he doesn't know how because he doesn't know the words in Vietnamese. And she, on the other hand, is trying really hard to make her child understand that she's there for him and that she's very happy with everything that he is. But she also doesn't quite have the vocabulary to communicate that to him. So they circuitously tell each other stories over the course of some traumatic events that kind of shape their relationship and kind of solidify the experience that they have together through storytelling.
It's such a powerful read. And I've heard you talk a lot before about the power of language. And I'd love to talk about it, but I first have to ask you, I think I saw that you got a shout out on RuPaul's Drag Race Instagram the other day. How did that feel?
Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm, going completely out of my noodle. I was so excited because it was an Instagram takeover of Jujubee, who I adore. So I was really excited. She really enjoyed the Magic Fish and shouted it out on the official RuPaul's Drag Race Instagram. So that was a really nice surprise earlier on in the week.
It was awesome. It was so awesome. So if anyone had any doubts, like it's a great book to read, one of many, but definitely RuPaul's Drag Race shout out. That's pretty cool. And then Amelie, I would also like to chat with you and see if you can tell us about the Blood Heir series. We've got book 2, Red Tigress, went on sale just this past March. There they are, the book babies. Can you tell us about this series?
Yeah, absolutely. So Red Tigress is the second installment to Blood Heir, which is about an exiled heir who has the power to control blood, and she and her kind are deemed kind of monsters in their society. And she has to resolve her father's murder. And she meets a handsome con man while she's at it. And then together they find out that there is much more to this murder than they originally thought, and they uncover a lot of darkness and corruption in their empire. And so Red Tigress it's the second book. I think it dials up the angst and the drama, as well as kind of bridges an overall series arc to a greater and darker magic that they hadn't known about before.
Truly darker magic. Like Amelie goes there. You guys, you've got to dive into this one. What, if anything, are you hoping your readers take away now that you're into book 2 before you get to book 3? What are you hoping they get from the novels?
I'm hoping that they can learn to, this is a book about kind of outcasts and people who felt like they didn't belong. And as someone who is a Chinese diaspora who's living kind of across different countries, I kind of channeled my experiences into this and my thoughts. So I'm kind of hoping that my readers can know that, you know, you are who you are and you're beautiful because of it. And you shouldn't change because society doesn't want you there.
I love that. And I think that's a great segue into something else I wanted to talk to with you guys. This past year has obviously been an incredibly difficult year for so many different reasons, and especially being part of the Asian American Pacific Islander community. We're just getting through celebrating AAPI Heritage Month, which has been lovely to see so much representation in so many different ways. If you're comfortable sharing, I was hoping that maybe you could all go around and we could share a little bit about our cultural identities, our heritage. I myself am half Chinese, half Caucasian, grew up in America. That would love to see if you guys are willing to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess I can go first. So I am Chinese. I'm from China, from Beijing, but my parents had me actually in France. So it's a bit of an odd mixture there. And I feel like I have to go way back to tell my life story. So my parents were part of the first wave of students that were allowed after China's reform and reopening to go and study abroad. And they decided to go study in France and immigrated there. And then when I was 6 years old, we came back to Beijing where I grew up. And then I came to the US for college. So currently living in New York. And yeah.
All around the world. That's so cool. So do you speak French as well?
I try. So yeah, I say I'm trilingual, but it's gotten so rusty because there's no one to practice with. So yeah, it's so important. So right now I'm just trying to like maintain my like native Chinese and native English, and then hopefully someday I'll
add the third one in there. Well, thanks, Amelie. And what about you, Trung?
I am Vietnamese American. My parents were kind of they were sort of the later end of the boat people who sort of like absconded, left Vietnam sort of after the war. And so they were boat people in the 80s. And so I was actually born in the Philippines, and then we won the green card lottery. And so we moved over here when I was 2 or 3. And yeah, and I've been in the Midwest in the United States ever since.
What about you, Elizabeth?
So my family is mostly from China, but they kind of moved all over Asia. So it's a little complicated. But my mother's side of the family came to America like several generations before. So I don't know, I'm probably like 4th or 5th generation on that side. And my father's side of the family is mostly in Southeast Asia. So a lot of Malaysia and Singapore.
What I think is really interesting about the way you all shared your backgrounds and your stories is the importance of our parents' journeys. And it's interesting, a lot of people talk about why literature as a space where teenage characters harness their autonomy and their coming of age. And I'm curious in your stories, and I know like I think about Six Crimson Cranes in particular, the relationship Shiori has with her stepmother, like there's a lot happening there. How do you approach that, and how does your relationship with your parents come into the way you build your characters and their families?
So I can go first. Actually, my dad told me a lot of fairy tales when I grew up, and not just the Western fairy tales that most of us may be familiar with. He told me fairy tales from all around the world, and a lot of the Southeast Asian and Chinese ones as well. So I think that was really, really inspiring for me, and a lot of the stories have stuck with me as I've grown up and have inspired, for instance, the legends and folk tales that I draw upon for Spin the Dawn and Six Crimson Cranes. So it's been really, those memories have been really vital, as well as I think family is a really big, has a really big role in the characters, especially family has a really big role in my stories. Like Maya, for instance, in Sin the Dawn, sacrifices everything to protect her father and her brothers. And Shuri is very similar. She has to break her brother's curse, and she's willing to do anything to do that.
They create really powerful bonds too, and I think it's magical as much as the magic in the story is magical. The way that family is their reason to be. Raison d'être. If I pretended I spoke French for a minute, like Amelie. Would anyone else like to jump in?
Yeah, I can go. I think, so one of the new, if you've read Blood Heir, there are 2 POVs from Anna the heir and Ramson the con man. And then in Red Tigress, a new POV that I was super excited about was Lynette Ko, who is East Asian, Chinese inspired. She's an assassin, and she was actually brought over to Cerealia, which is the empire in the Blood Heir trilogy, at a really young age. And I think a lot of my own like culture and experiences, and especially what Liz was talking about with like filial piety and family, reflects in Lynn's journey. For her, the entire book, mostly she is thinking about her homeland, Chimera, and she's thinking about her mother and her brother, whom she followed over to the new land. And so there's this kind of a lot of like a diaspora experience reflected in her. And it was just, it just felt like I was writing out my heart when I wrote Lynn. So yeah.
Oh, I love that. Then everybody go read about Lynn, get to book 2. And Trung, I'll turn it to you.
Sure. So I address family in a much more direct and kind of mundane way. Much of the book takes place in a very slice of life format, like it's set kind of in the real world. It happens in the 90s, and so there are kind of like very particular experiences of immigrant families that I kind of wanted to touch upon. And I, like, by my observation, kind of when I was growing up, there were kind of a lot of stories about like kind of diasporic Asian American families, and there are like a lot of stories about intergenerational strife, and when relationships are really fraught. And there's either like, it kind of goes between that and like this really intense like filial piety, and that's not really something that like all Asian families kind of have. Like, we have sort of common roots, but there are little distinctions between the ways that we experience our culture. And so like kind of like as a Vietnamese American person who's kind of first and a half gen, like I didn't really have a lot of the same kind of like tropes that I absorbed from Asian American stories that I read growing up. I tended to have like a pretty chill family experience for the most part. And so I wanted to tell a story about family members who kind of are trying to connect with each other and make sure that they don't miss out on each other's lives over this kind of like really large language and cultural barrier. There's this understanding that I have that a lot of immigrant families are very precious about the opportunities that are afforded to their children. And so that sort of becomes like, it's reflected in this very kind of like stern way. But I think a lot of times, like the priorities that I saw growing up were more about like, well, we've been through quite a lot of trauma. What are the ways that we can maintain relationships with each other in this really, in our day-to-day lives in meaningful ways? And that's kind of what I wanted to center in The Magic Fish.
And you did it really beautifully. So from there, and talking about how your family stories influence the work, we all, of course, then become our own self-realized, actualized individuals. And you've touched on it a little bit, each of you, but I'd like to dig in a little more, if you'll let me, into how your cultural identity or your relationship with your cultural identity, wherever you grew up, wherever you are in life, influenced the way you wrote your books or the settings you chose for them. I'll give you all a second to think too. So whoever wants to jump in first, you're welcome to jump in.
Okay, I can go. In Six Crimson Cranes, a lot of Six Crimson Cranes is based, as I mentioned earlier, on the Western fairy tale, The Wild Swans, but there's a lot of East Asian folklore and legends woven into the story as well as into the setting. So some of these stories would include like Madam Whitesnake, which is a a famous Chinese legend about a snake spirit who turns into a human. And then I also drew upon some Japanese folklore, the tale of the bamboo cutter, which is about a radiant princess whose hand is sought by numerous suitors until her true heritage is found out. So she has a very mysterious background, and I really enjoyed weaving that into some of the arcs in Six Crimson Cranes. And there are also lesser known folk tales that I wove in, such as The Girl with a Black Bowl, which is about a girl who has to wear a black bowl over her face to hide her identity so that people wouldn't exploit her for her beauty. So it was just a joy to be able to combine these Western fairy tales with these Chinese and Japanese folklore, that it felt like it really represented myself as I grew up, because like in school, I would learn Western literature, but then at home, I would get my these really rich stories from my parents and my grandparents. And I hadn't seen too many books with that confluence of stories. So it was really important to me to include both in my work.
I think it builds such a rich narrative and a history that it's part of what makes your story so deep and so engrossing. And I think that it's going to be really cool one day, like the more books like yours out in the world, hopefully there will be readers who grew up to become writers who say, I grew up reading books from all over the world, stories about all these different cultures and backgrounds. And I can't wait to read all the future writers' books out there too, because you're so right. That really does inspire where your creativity comes from. Yeah. Fingers crossed. We know you're tuning in, writers. Get writing, submit your books. It'll happen. Did anyone else want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I really resonated with what Liz said about, stories from all over the world, because where I grew up, it was an international community in Beijing. And so my friends were kind of from all over the world. Like a lot of them were from Europe, or like the Americas, or places in Africa. And in writing Blood Heir, there are characters from so many different places in the world that kind of reflect into these characters. So I think it's a lot of an experience of being diaspora. Like there are elements of, obviously with Lynn, there's elements of my upbringing and my own heart, but I also wanted to reflect the world as I saw it growing up, which wasn't just strictly Chinese or Beijing. It was, friends from all over the world coming together and being able to exchange ideas culturally and also linguistically. So I think that's where it was influenced in Blood Heir.
And I'll jump off of that one. I think you've mentioned it now that there are so many characters. There are a few characters who have multicultural backgrounds. I think it was Anna, it was May. I think Ramson was also multicultural background. And hearing your history, it does make a lot of sense how you could pull from so many different cultures to build these. But I'm curious, when building them, what were you hoping your readers would see in them beyond just they come from different places? What was it like writing about them? What was it like having so many of them? I think you really balanced so many different cultures so beautifully. It was an awesome crew to watch throughout the series.
Yeah, I think one of my, the messages that from readers that I remember the most was this reader called May, who was, I think, Hmong in ethnicity, I think. And she told me that she had never seen an Asian character called May before with her name. And she's told me, I think it meant small in her language, which is interesting because it means little sister in Chinese. So just seeing her, take the time to reach out and say, oh, wow, I feel so represented in your books. And I think as a writer, that's one of my greatest goals, is to have a diverse cast and see the world as it exists for me, and have my readers feel like they can find pieces of themselves in my books.
And conventions are such a great place to do that with people. So hopefully we'll all be back in person sooner rather than later. And then Trung, if you don't mind, I had another question for you too. I wanted to make sure I asked you.
Mm-hmm.
In The Magic Fish, water plays such a huge role. And again, I believe you've spoken about your use of water before, but could you tell us what water represents and how exactly you used it in your novel?
Sure. Well, water represents sort of a barrier and also sort of a place. I think one of the things that one of the distinctions between a lot of kind of like different communities of immigrants is that sometimes you have immigrants who kind of like have a little bit more access, and oftentimes like communities like mine and families like mine kind of come from a space where we're refugees, and so there are barriers that we can't overcome. There are places that we can't go, barring all of the right paperwork over, you know, an appropriate amount of time according to whichever government we happen to find ourselves in. And so much of the ways that water is used is this sort of like this large and kind of like scary and mysterious space where we often find ourselves sort of floating kind of in between two spaces and two shores that we understand really well. And so water is often represents kind of like this, like it's usually, it thematically tends to tie in with like the ways that the characters are uncertain about where, you know, each other kind of stands and which shore they essentially come from. The water in the, like in a lot of the fairy tales are kind of like, are used in a similar way that the characters sort of experience the ocean kind of in the real world as well. And so there's just a lot of, kind of ruminating about the nature of barriers and how kind of water is something that you can't speak through. Water is something that you have to traverse, and water is something that is both really beautiful but also really devastating in the ways that it can separate you from the people that you love.
That's so beautifully said. Of course, you're a writer, but I think that when you also see the way you do that in the art, it really is magical and it transports you. And I love hearing you speak about that. So thanks for sharing that with us. And then Elizabeth, I also had a question I was hoping to circle back on with you. In both Spin the Dawn in the series and in Six Crimson Cranes so far, I've always loved the way your stories highlight both the bold, out loud, in your face, but also the more subtle or sometimes invisible power of women in the worlds of your stories. Can you talk about how your characters find and harness their powers, be they magical or practical?
Sure. So I guess the power of women is a little bit louder. It's in Spin the Dawn. It was an issue that I really thought about deeply as I was writing the story. For those of you who haven't read it, Spin the Dawn is about a tailor who dreams of becoming the best at her craft. But in her world, women are not allowed to become tailors. They're only allowed to become seamstresses. And so Maya Tamarin, much like in the Mulan fashion, disguises herself as a boy to enter the imperial tailoring competition and to prove herself as the best in her craft. And for me, I was a very young, new writer. And as I was writing this book, a lot of my experiences in my past life as a musician were very much in the foreground. As a aspiring composer, I have been told many times that I wouldn't make it in the field because, well, like I was a woman and an Asian American woman, or just Asian woman at that. Like there's no chance I was going to become the next Hans Zimmer or John Williams. It just wasn't in the cards. And so that always stuck with me, even as I transitioned into becoming a writer. Though just having those people tell me that I couldn't do something just because I was a woman always stuck with me and found its way into Maya's story. With Shiori, she's not struggling so much in her position because of her, because she's a woman, but I feel like she does have a very, how do I say it? I think she does have an incredible journey from girl to woman. She goes through so much. There's so much against her with this curse that she really grows. And I think, I don't know, I can't really say much without spoiling the story, but she matures a lot. And I think she grows a lot stronger during the course of the story. And it's very similar to Maya in many ways.
They were both, I wanted to be their best friends. I wanted to be their sidekicks. I just wanted to like hang out with them and also hang out with dragons, but like mostly with your characters as well.
Thanks.
And speaking of dragons, and obviously we're here talking at Comic-Con at home, we can't sit here together and not talk about the power and magic and majesty of fantasy in storytelling. All three of your stories dive into the fairy tale, the lore, fantastical elements. Can one or all of you talk about the influence that your childhood fairy tales had on you. I know Elizabeth, you already talked about it a little bit, but I'm curious if there's something essential about those stories that captured your interest and made you want to keep writing them out.
I guess I can go. So Flutter originally was kind of an Anastasia retelling, and growing up, I had grown up with, I watched like Disney in French, and there was a time when I thought like the company was French, and like all the actors I saw on TV were French because they were all dubbed. So I grew up with like a lot of like fairy tales from the West as well as from the East, and it felt like two completely different worlds to me. And then originally this was meant to be an Anastasia retelling of the Romanov family in Russia, as well as the Fox animation, if you guys have seen it. And then as I wrote it, I started to really, really deviate from it. And I thought, what if I had a female character who was, multicultural and totally unapologetic in the way she stands up to people, and she has so much power. Like, it's pretty terrifying how much blood she can control and how she flings people around in the books. Hold on, I just totally lost track. Fairy tales, right?
Fairy tales.
Yeah, so I think I took what was meant to be a retelling or a fairy tale, and I kind of spun it into my own experience with characters from around the world, with themes that are entrenched in the history of my own country and my family history. And this kind of Flutter kind of became its own bloody little thing that, took a premise and just unraveled.
I love that you called it a bloody little thing, because fairy tales are nothing if not incredibly bloody. When you go way back to that source material, you're like, oh, that it was a little violent. That was a little much. I think the other thing about fantasy stories and what I love talking about authors is the world building. So instead of asking you how it was or like what went into it, but I just point blank, did you find the world building to be something that was really difficult, or was it something you really loved doing in your stories?
I thought the world building was going to be really easy because it takes place in the real world in times that most of us have lived through. But it wound up being incredibly challenging because one of the things that I needed to try to do visually that I didn't have to worry about quite so much in a prose novel is that I'm drawing all of these things too. And so I have to do a lot of visual research and iconography to make sure that I was really intentional about the ways that everything was depicted. And so not only did I have to do a lot of research into like the fun stuff, like, oh, what did people wear in the 90s? And what did my parents wear? And what were my outfits looking like when I was going to school? I also kind of got a chance to sort of like delve into like each of the characters' imaginations too. Like, why do these characters think that the world looks the way that it does in their brains? Like, why does the young boy's fairy tales look like this? And why does his mother's fairy tales look like this? And what does her aunt's fairy tale, why do her aunt's fairy tales look like this? And I got to kind of delve into the history of why, of sort of like the Disneyfying of like the Disney or of the princess phenomenon, and like why we think of princess dresses being cut that way, and how much of a relationship that has with kind of austerity measures that went on during the Second World War. And suddenly after that, in the 50s, mid-century Western couture culture became very extravagant and huge again. And so I got to really look at dresses that way. And then for the sort of like Vietnamese segments, I needed to identify like what clothing looked like in 1950s in Vietnam. And that's something that it had never occurred to me to look into before, because all the images that I was familiar with had to do with war. And so looking into telling stories from the perspective of a character and trying to unravel their imaginations in a visual way to get you to like really see the world through their eyes and see their fantasies through their eyes was something that I had to do a lot of work to make sure that I got approximately correctly, so that I could sort of bring the characters to life. So even though my story was told in a very mundane world, I had to do quite a lot of work to like bring people a little bit closer to the heart of the characters.
That's fascinating. It makes me curious if Amelie or if Elizabeth, what kind of research you might have dove into in your stories.
Can I actually go back to the fairy tale retelling question?
Absolutely. Please.
Okay, so I was thinking about it a little bit, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the Wild Swans fairy tale and why it appealed to me. the Wild Swans fairy tale is about a girl whose 6 feathers are turned into swans and cranes in my version. And one of the things I've always loved about it is that the princess, she's really unlike a lot of heroes in other fairy tales. She doesn't kiss anyone. She doesn't fall asleep. She doesn't need to be kissed by a prince to break the curse. Like, she really undergoes all the trials for herself. Like, she's a hero in her own right, and she chooses to undergo the trials to save her brothers as well as herself. And one of the things that she can't do while she's cursed is she can't speak. And it's not that she is cursed to be unable to speak. Like, she is not supposed to speak. Like, she can, and if for every word she utters, one of her brothers will die. So it's just this really painful curse that she has to endure. And in my retelling of it in Six Crimson Cranes, it's really a way that the free-spirited Shiori learns to grow, to have strength. Even though she can't speak, she has to learn to show her strength in other ways. And as a writer, that was a challenge as well as a joy to explore in her character development.
Oh, that's fascinating. I don't think I'd ever connected the dots too, that like, as a writer, words are your weapon, words are your power and your strength. And that must have been such a cool journey to figure out, because Sherry does come across as strong, but I can imagine that'd be a little difficult. I know we are probably running down on time a little bit, and I can't let you go without asking if you guys have any books that you're reading now, any other authors that you've just been a big fan of that you'd love to shout out.
I'm about to start. Oh.
Go ahead, Liz.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, I was super excited because I just got approved for the galley for a book called She Who Became the Sun. The author is Shelley Parker Chan. I hope that I got that right, but I have been so excited about it since I found out. I think it is a queer retelling of one of the ancient Chinese emperors. And I read the opening and I was just like, I need this. I need it to be, it comes out in July. I need it to be July now. And then last night, like, the gods granted my wish and I got the arc. So I'm super excited to start reading that. There's just so much great detail and history of my country. So really excited to dive in there.
I wish everyone add that one to your TBR. Elizabeth and Trung, what about you guys?
Oh, I'm so jealous. I wanted to read that book as well. I'm about to start Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Min Tan. Yeah, and it's not out yet until next year, I believe. So I'm like really reading an early version, but I've heard so many good things about it. It's about, as the title suggests, the daughter of the moon goddess. And I hear that there's a really great romance in it. So I'm just like, I can't wait to start after I finish this deadline.
Right, after the deadline, only after the deadline. What about you, Trung?
Well, I mean, since I make graphic novels, I tend to like to recommend them as well so that people kind of like get into reading different kinds of formats of books. And recently one that really hit me really hard was, oh my gosh, the name is entirely escaping me right now.
It'll come to you.
Oh my gosh, it'll come to me. Well, a mainstay that I always recommend to people is Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me. It's so beautiful and it's so wonderfully written. It's by Mariko Tamaki and Rosemary Valera O'Connell. Oh yes, recently it was it was Displacement by Kiku Hughes. It's about Japanese American internment, and she kind of goes through her family history and has conversations with her older relatives about what that experience was like. It was unlike anything that I'd ever kind of read about or seen in my lifetime. And so I thought it was a really fascinating kind of broader look at Asian American identity and kind of different chapters of history that kind of got glossed over in my education. And then as far as prose books, I'm really looking forward to reading Dear Justice by Nick Stone. It's a follow-up to Dear Martin that was published in 2017, and it was so good. And I was like, I needed to read that first before I get into Dear Justice. So I'm very excited to get into that.
Those are all such good recommendations. So everybody, after you read these wonderful authors and creators' books, you now have a couple more to add to your TBR. So your summer is officially booked. With that, I just want to say a big thank you to Amelie, Elizabeth, and Trung for hanging out with us for the past little while and talking all things books. Readers out there, you know what to do. Go add it to your Goodreads, go add it to your cart, go pass it along to a friend, check it out from your library, ask your teacher for it. All of the above works. Just get reading and have a great summer and keep on celebrating all of the AAPI voices that are out there. Thank you so much, everybody.